This is the Vanguard Circle broadcast, weekly broadcast on behalf of the Jewish Socialist Bund. And we can be found at the website Jewish Socialist Bund with hyphens.net. And we are engaged here in the 14th episode of the reading of Lars Fischer's study and book published by Cambridge University Press, entitled The Socialist Response to Anti-Semitism in the German Imperial State during the time of the Second Internationals. In other words, it's a critique of the Second International and of Marxism as classically interpreted by the Second International, of the Jewish identity, what was called the Jewish question or the Jewish problem. And Lars Fischer is dissecting that whole episode of insanity when Jewish people were considered to be something apart, to say the least. Okay, so let's go and share some work here. Okay, I think I can find it there. Yeah, here it is. Okay. This is page 108, and we continue on. Mehring, who was in any case a hopeless public speaker, was utterly overwhelmed by the events unfolding at the Congress. He told the delegates that he had been warned just before the Congress that something was being planned against him. It was now clear that his opponents had spent weeks, probably even months, preparing this ambush against him. They had spent all that time compiling material pertaining to the last 25 years of his life. He could not possibly now get hold of all the material required to refute their claims while the Congress was still in session. He had never denied his checkered past. He had never forced himself upon the party and would have understood had it rejected him. Yet the party leadership had nevertheless seen fit to enlist his support. Consequently, those who now questioned the legitimacy of his role in the party were actually questioning the party leadership who had bestowed that role upon him. This lent the assault on him a significance that went beyond the merely personal. The party leadership would need to decide whether the accusations against him were true or not. Until it had done so, he would suspend his activities for the Neue Zeit and the Leipziger Volkszeitung. To help clear his name, Mehring then began to compile and annotate the relevant material, and in late October, some 5 weeks after the Congress, he published it in a pamphlet form as Meine Rechtfertigung, my justification. Throughout this time, the controversy raged on, claims and counterclaims abounding in the party press. A second edition of Meine Rechtfertigung followed with little more than a fortnight. In its appendix, Mehring addressed new issues that had been raised following the initial publication of Meine Rechtfertigung. The Parteivorstand finally decided the issue on 23rd November. It cleared Mehring's name and asked him to take up his work for the Neue Zeit again. At the same time, the party leadership in Leipzig asked him to resume his work for the Leipziger Volkszeitung. It was in this context, following the publication of Mehring's Meine Rechtsfertigung, that Edmund Fischer published his critique of Mehring in Das Am Teufel aus der Oberlausitz. Fischer had in fact already been among Mehring's assailants in Dresden. It was there that he first introduced the issue of Mehring's dealings with the former anti-Semitic deputy Hans Luss. To his mind, these dealings were a weighty case in point for the argument against Mehring. And as he now reiterated, Luss had not been rejected by the party because he was an adulterer and perjured convict, as Mehring seemed to be suggesting. What had jarred with so many in the party was, quote, the fact that we were expected to welcome with open arms the former anti-Semitic leader who came with Mehring's warm recommendation in order to let him play a role in our rows. I, like many others, could not understand this peculiar introduction into our party of this former anti-Semitic chieftain with whom we had previously concerned ourselves critically on dozens of occasions in the press and in pamphlets. Sounds like Trump. As I suggested earlier, if an accusation of this sort was made against a public figure today, they could surely be no doubt as to what its thrust is. Let us assume for a moment that Fisher's critique did hinge on the notion that Mehring had revealed his own susceptibility to anti-Semitism by supporting Luce. In that case, Fisher's critique would finally provide us with hard evidence for the notion that Mehring's stance was at odds with that of the most, or at least some, of his peers, and that he did take him to task for it. As I have already indicated, though, while this seems the most obvious and indeed the only plausible interpretation of Fisher's critique to us, Fisher's intentions were in fact completely different. Okay. The anti-Semitic deputy Hans Luce. Who then was Hans Luce? And what was the nature of Mehring's involvement with him? Initially a conservative, Luce, of 1861 to 1920, became an outright anti-Semite in late 1888 when Adolf Stoicher appointed him as the founding editor of the Christian Social Party organ Das Volk. It was here that Luce met one of the other young hopefuls of the anti-Semitic movement, Helmut von Gerlach, 1861-1935, who was to become a lifelong friend. In 1890, Luce abandoned the Christian Social Party for the more anti-authoritarian and more militantly anti-Semitic German Social Party, on whose ticket he was elected to the Reichstag for Eschweg-Schmalkalden in 1893. This was no mean achievement for a man in his early 30s. Yet Luce's spectacularly promising career came to an abrupt and equally spectacular end only a year later. Luce perjured himself in order to defend the honor of a woman with whom he had an adulterous affair. When his partners subsequently broke down in court and admitted the affair, Luce's previous denial notwithstanding, he was sentenced to Zuchthaus and imprisoned in cell for 40 months. His reputation irredeemably tarnished, his political career in the anti-Semitic movement was over. During this time in the Reichstag, okay, I'm going to take a break. Just a moment. Okay, now we can continue here and share. There we are at page 110. During his time in the Reichstag, Luce submitted a contribution to the Zukunft that Harden published in May 1894. It offered us an interesting insight into Luce's frame of mind at the time and is worth looking at in some detail so that we can later gauge the extent to which the stance of the former anti-Semite Luce actually differed from that of Luce, the anti-Semitic deputy. As Luce explained, he had been reading the Zukunft since early 1893 and was impressed by it, for he had repeatedly come across comments in the Zukunft that indicated their author's objective approach to anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites are, after all, not exactly spoiled in this respect. Indeed, given the rough treatment they usually have to put up with, quote, we anti-Semites are somewhat surprised when we occasionally encounter an attempt in the non-anti-Semitic press to judge this movement objectively. The Zukunft was apparently happy to provide a forum for such attempts, and he therefore hoped that it might also be willing to publish what he had to say on the matter. This then began with a discussion of the causes and origins of the anti-Semitic movement. The Social Democrats, in particular, misrepresented the anti-Semitic movement by claiming that it had, quote, exclusively economic causes, unquote. In fact, there was far more to it. It was certainly, quote, not true that Stocker had started it. The boot is on the other clerical foot. Not the Protestant Stoker, but organized political Catholicism had started the anti-Jewish campaign during the Kulturkampf. The crucial impulse, however, had come from an altogether different corner. It was the position taken by, quote, the Jewish press during the Kulturkampf that had provided the decisive impulse. In a sense, history had repeated itself here. For centuries earlier, in Spain, the impulse for the expulsion of the Jews had also been given by the assault, at the time, of the Morenos, Nuevos Cristianos, or the Catholic Church. Those whose animosity towards the Jews was not economically or religiously motivated had been perturbed by the undue legislative influence of the Jews, Lasky and Bamberger. They attributed their own economic difficulties and a general failure to rein in market forces and curtail the Gründerei, the fanatic economic bustle following the establishment of the German Reich in 1871, to the Jewish influence. That is, they attributed their own economic difficulties and general failure to rein in the market forces and curtail to the Jewish influence. Another factor that drove people towards anti-Semitism was the, quote, strong participation of Jewish politicians in social democratic propaganda. Given that so many people had so many good reasons to support the anti-Semites, one might well wonder why the likes of Stoker had not been more successful. As we saw, Luce himself had defected from Stoker's camp in 1890. It hardly comes as much of a surprise, therefore, that Luce held Stoker himself responsible for his lack of success. He had done a good job of bringing anti-Semitic convictions to the Protestant masses, but then he concentrated too exclusively on Berlin. Quote, had Stocker invested half the effort he squandered on Berlin in the provinces and gone beyond the oratory to undertake actual organizational work, Luke suggested, he would stand at the helm of an anti-Semitic faction of between 50 and 80 deputies today. One thing that he had very substantially aided, quote unquote, the anti-Semitic cause, was the inauguration of the Abwehrverein, the small association of non-Jewish, mostly liberal anti-Judeophobic dignitaries, established in 1890. The very extensive cross-section of the German people had remained passive vis-a-vis the anti-Semitic movement, Luce explained. Yet, that by no means implied that they, quote, nurtured friendly feelings for the Jews, Judenfreundlich. Hence, even though they did not support the anti-Semitic cause, they were nevertheless, quote, annoyed when they were suddenly expected to support the Jewish cause, unquote. This was something the Abwehrverein had entirely failed to take into account. By attempting to mobilize them in defense of the Jews, the Abwehrverein was in fact driving people into the arms of the anti-Semites. The demand for anti-Semitic publications had also increased to a quite extraordinary degree as a result of the Abwehrverein's activities. For many people, only became aware of the existence of these anti-Semitic publications thanks to the anti-Judeophobic counter-propaganda. Yeah, drink here. Now, it was generally assumed at the time by well-meaning Jews and non-Jews alike that anti-Judeophobic arguments were only credible when articulated by non-Jews. Alverwering, therefore, bent over backwards to ensure it could not possibly be denounced as a Jewish organization acting merely out of self-interest. Yet this did not prevent Luce from claiming that the way in which the association worked epitomized bad Jewish practice. Throughout history, various nationalities had had exactly the same experience with the Jews. Quotes, as clever as the Jewish nationality is in other respects, however apt it is in asserting its interests and acquiring influence and power, when defending itself against attacks, it always becomes impudent and excessive. Had the German Jews responded to the first stirrings of anti-Semitism in the late 70s and early 80s with a little preparedness to act against the deplorable state of affairs, had they imposed greater reticence upon themselves and the press and the economy, the anti-Semitic movement would have been nipped in the bud, whereas now it not only achieves direct electoral successes, but has carried its stance into the other parties, the conservatives, the national liberals, and the Zentrum. Unquote. The people had now witnessed more than enough Jewish abuses. The principle of tolerance at any price was therefore increasingly being replaced by that of national egoism. Any judicious assessment of the anti-Semitic movement would surely have to conclude, quote, that it represents the outrage, the revolt of a people that is rebelling against a powerful other, machtig gewordenes Fremdem, and seeks to shake off this other. One may deem such rebellions justified or not. One may see in them a source of vigor or just a barbaric brutalization. The fact itself, however, one should concede. The national energy of a people draws strength from opposition to the other, das Fremde, against an other that it feels and recognizes as disgraceful and oppressive. Ein als schandlich und bedenkend empfindendes und erkennend Fremden. Was not the affirmation of the stark juxtaposition of non-Jews versus Jews as the other likely to promote violent anti-Jewish instincts? Far from it, Luce argued. The anti-Semitic movement was doing the exact opposite. It was redirecting those instincts in an orderly fashion that was conducive to the nation's reinvigoration. Make America great again, is that it? Moreover, he contended somewhat ambiguously, the awareness of the great superiority in numbers precludes any idea of a bloody struggle. Lütige Auseinandersetzungen. It is not entirely clear what he meant there. Perhaps the suggestion was that it would obviously be quite unnecessary for the overwhelming majority of non-Jews to resort to violence in dealing with so minuscule a minority as the Jews. Alternatively, he may have felt that no self-respecting majority of such overwhelming proportions would stoop so low as to apply violence to resolve its differences with so minuscule a minority. Either way, this too is a formulation that may have seemed remotely plausible in a world before Auschwitz, but certainly no longer does so now. Admittedly, Luce went on, the programs of the anti-Semitic parties were still in the process of gestation, yet they were not simply restricted to anti-Semitic negation. They also took issue with many other achievements of the liberal era. They'd taken up the economic aspirations of the farmers and artisans as well as a whole range of social and other issues. It was therefore unjust to accuse anti-Semitism of amounting to no more than dull anti-Jewish incitement, or the Judenhetzen. At the moment, the vision of a total separation of Jews and Germans was really no more than pie in the sky, Luce added. The anti-Semites' demands and aspirations for the immediate future were far more modest. the abolition of emancipation, the prohibition of ritual slaughter, and later perhaps the elimination of circumcision. In the meantime, they simply hoped that the progress of the movement itself might neutralize Jewish influence. What, then, of the common suggestion that any wholesale removal of the Jews would change nothing, because non-Jews would simply take their place and act in the same way? This was an erroneous assumption, Luce insisted. The negative and divisive qualities that produce social conflict had been brought into society by the Jews. Foremost among these negative qualities was the Jews' boundlessly contaminating addiction to profit. Alles durch schon der Profit weg. No other negative quality was remotely as contagious. Society could only rise from the squalor and corruption of this addiction if the Jewish example was eliminated. If the Jews really were put in their place, though, society would be able to cleanse itself of the Jewish contamination. It would shed its divisive qualities, and social conflict would become a thing of the past. Because the non-Jews would no longer be contaminated by the Jewish addiction to profit once the Jews had been removed. The notion of taking the Jews' place and continuing their exploitative practices would be anathema to them. Whatever else one might want to say for or against anti-Semitism, Luce concluded his discussion in Zukunft, one thing was surely undeniable. The anti-Semitic movement had already demonstrated its ability to bring out the best in its supporters who showed a degree of enthusiasm and dedication that immunized them against the fanaticism of social democracy, while the old parties had become so lackluster that only reliance on the state's instruments of coercion allowed them to persevere. Okay, let's leave it at that. Wow. The defense of the Jewish people against the anti-Semites was no defense at all, really, and merely contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism, which even in its nascent forms was talking about the elimination of something they called the Jewish essence of capitalism. So what happened after the Jewish people were gone from Germany? Did capitalism disappear? Well, actually, for a while in half of Germany, but not by revolution. And so it degenerated into capitalism again, without the help of the Jewish people. And that should bring it to an appropriate conclusion. And this is Dr. Abraham Weisfeld speaking to you, political scientist from the University of Quebec Montreal, speaking to you now on behalf of the Jewish Socialist Bund. And we're back.